As far as I know, the arguments for God I elaborate here, plus 6 other analogously argued ones, are the only valid and unassailably premised deductive arguments for the existence of God to date. Sadly, believers in God are, almost to a person, too unreflective to even understand them, in spite of their logical elegance and simplicity. But the most important thing to remember about these arguments is that they depend on the criteria of truth and morality in the 2 logically self-refuting deductive arguments for atheism. There are 8 deductive arguments for God, only 2 of which are developed here. The other 6 analogously involve the ultimate criteria of purpose, intelligibility, meaning, communication, mind, and personhood. If there are more, they too will depend on the ultimate background criteria of general rationality. There simply is nothing more logically basic than the ultimate meta-theoretic assumptions of the system of inquiry that is necessary to approach any issue, including the issue of God's existence. Both arguments elaborated here are based on prior criteria that is already being used generally in conducting the analysis of anything. You can't escape the need for an ultimate standard without that attempted escape itself assuming that standard's ultimacy in the escape process. Any argument for denying that standard necessarily uses that same ultimate rational standard of thought in order to try to infer its own conclusion on the issue. And the mind relations involved between that adjudicating system and one's own mind are ultimate and indistinguishable from a finite mind's necessary relations to an ultimate personal God. This cannot be denied without both assuming it and operating according to it in the process of communicating that denial. So reason has universal, ultimate, comprehensive belief-deciding authority, the final court of appeal of all possible truth claims. But those characteristics make reason indistinguishable from God. Any attempt to deny or circumvent the ultimate authority of reason is self-contradictory. All anti-rationalist views, in spite of their differences, rely on the same principles they are trying to undermine. The voice of reason is silently literal and indicates its personhood as logos. The meta-theoretic breakdown of atheism began in 1929 when Wilbur Marshall Urban realized that naturalism's own universal claims and assumptions, along with its reduction of all reality to specific causal factors, deductively refute naturalism itself. Both determinism and naturalism render themselves and belief in them to also be merely accidental, causally eventuated effects of evolving matter, products of the universally determining factors they specify, and nothing more. Consequently, what naturalism says about itself implies its own coherence and meaninglessness, because it too is, according to its own assertion, merely causally eventuated by naturalistic factors and nothing more. And even that fact itself cannot be known for the same reason. Consequently, so-called truth is rendered a myth by naturalism, completely insignificant compared to sheer physical causation, the exclusive comprehensive determiner that naturalism specifies in order to be the theory that it is. But even though naturalism was thereby exposed as self-destroying with deductive logical finality, within 3 decades, philosophical atheism produced, completely aside from naturalism, three pivotal deductive arguments for atheism, discovered and elaborated by British philosopher Antony Flew from the 1940s through the 1980s. His landmark book, God and Philosophy, was published in 1966, with a new introduction added to the 1986 edition entitled God, A Critical Inquiry. Those three arguments, although immensely influential for decades, are based on self-referential fallacies. Flew's first deductive argument for atheism, the unfalsifiability argument or invisible Gardner argument, was that since there is no way to verify or falsify belief in God, it is consequently incoherent and therefore meaningless. God is claimed to be an invisible gardener who eludes all attempts at detection and is therefore indistinguishable from something just imagined or made up or nothing at all. But the fallacy of that argument is that it already uses unverifiable and unfalsifiable general rationality itself, which includes both formal and applied logic, as an ultimate God of mind. It even defines mind itself in its own necessary operational assumptions. Flew's second deductive argument for atheism, Stratonicionism, or the Stratonican argument, reasoned that it's impossible for there to be an overarching explanation of the universe itself or the total reality, because the criterion of explanatory adequacy within the world is the only meaningful model of explanation we have or can possibly have. In other words, intra-world explanations of things within our world, are all we have to go on and all we use, and are the only possible basis of any explanation of anything, including the total reality itself. An overall explanation is no explanation at all because it makes no sense in relation to our possible experience of explanation. The problem with this argument is that the criterion of explanatory adequacy itself functions as an ultimate overarching explanation of the total reality, not a mere intra-world explanation that the argument claims all explanations are reducible to, which is self-contradictory in being self-referentially inconsistent. In fact, if the only possible explanations were intra-world explanations, you couldn't know that fact itself. This self-reference error is common to almost 24 major philosophies throughout human history. Flew's third deductive argument for atheism, called the presumption argument, argued for the logically prior necessity of procedurally assuming atheism by default in analyzing anything, since God is not a requirement for any argument to either be begun or validly reasoned to a conclusion. Consistent with the biblical notion of humanity's separation from God, this is a valid argument until you realize what it both assumes and implies. The fatal error of this argument is that it uses general reason or rationality itself as not only a God of mind, but as God of this issue itself, which pertains universally to what is or is not a rationally necessary prior assumption about the ultimate governance of analysis itself, regardless of the subject matter. These three arguments had a devastating effect on belief in God among intellectual influencers in the Western world in the decades that followed, assisted by the emergence of various relativistic perspectives such as pragmatism, subjectivism, social constructivism, conventionalism, naturalized epistemology, and postmodernist perspectives generally. So by the beginning of the 1970s, Antony Flew was, far and away, the most influential atheistic thinker in history. In 1971, Antony Flew's finest student, American-Canadian philosopher Kai Nielsen, in his book Ethics Without God, stated the following simple but unprecedented observation. In any possible argument for God's goodness, we are already assuming an ultimate criterion for anything to be considered good in order to even begin analyzing the issue. The goal of analysis is to find an argument that has valid reasoning and true assumptions, which is a universal good of thought in thinking about morality or anything else itself. But a non-moral good cannot decide what a moral good is, which means that logical validity is a required, already existing universal and ultimate good, the only standard for knowing what is good in any sense and in any realm, whether in theory or in ordinary everyday moral and ethical aspects of life. In my opinion, this prior criterion point makes Kai Nielsen the greatest thinker of all time, which means, of course, that he is the greatest atheist thinker of all time as well, replacing Antony Flew at that point. Yet the argument saved belief in God by accident, while Nielsen himself thought he was refuting belief in God. Because his prior criterion observation inadvertently led to my 2012 discoveries of the following two ultra-deductive arguments for the existence of God. These arguments are based on the entire comprehensive system of deductive argumentation rules, formal logic, and generally empirically informed rationality. The basic operational concepts and rules for functioning as a mind prove God's existence to the point where any opposition to this conclusion itself assumes all the same God-level and God-like characteristics about general rationality itself in that same process of trying to argue against it. Reason itself has qualities that are indistinguishable from the qualities of God. Whether you are an atheist or a believer, you're ultimately relying on the authority of reason, which functions as God of mind. That is not to say that atheists and agnostics secretly believe in God, but they still treat reason as inherently God-like, an ideal, morally obligating system of mind that tests for truth. So this reflexive meta-theoretic moral criterion argument reveals an ultimate level of moral goodness that must already be assumed in any analysis, including moral analysis. And that is the same system of inquiry that you are assuming at this very moment as you analyze what I am saying. Consequently, traditional arguments cannot possibly prove God's goodness, nor can any other possible argument, because all arguments for the goodness of God must already assume that it is an obligating ultimate moral good to always try to think in an empirically informed, rational way in general, whether about God or about anything else. And that must be done in order to survive, in order to reflect, and in order to thrive in a commonly real world. But a prior moral ideal that we must already assume in the general system-wide standards of analysis itself is a timelessly necessary intuition on pain of self-referential contradiction to prefer one thing, anything, over anything else. It is the ideal good by which all things must be morally and ethically evaluated. This moral ethical ideal is indistinguishable from a morally good, ultimate, and perfect mind, or logos, or God. The common claim that no one can know absolute universal objective truth is not only asserted as itself an absolute objective truth, which means it cannot itself be known, but also asserts absolute objective truth's unknowability itself as an item of knowledge that is known about absolute objective truth. The claim that everything is merely the efficiently caused product of determining factors such as natural selection, evolution, survival and reproductive advantage, instincts, genetics, or environmental influences, itself gets an arbitrary exemption from those influences in order to be proclaimed as some kind of objective universal truth. It's even claimed without any evidence or argument that there are no possible objectively true universal claims, even though that denial about universal claims is itself stated as objectively and universally true. These and similar claims have been constantly repeated for decades, and the question has arisen about what standards there could possibly be for believing those kinds of universal claims and denials about all universal claims in the first place. Those unaddressed lingering questions have in turn resulted in two new arguments for atheism, arguments operating at the highest possible level of analytic generality, belief authority, and life applicability. Both arguments involve theorizing about theorizing itself. They are the prior moral criterion argument and its logically parallel generalization, the prior truth criterion argument. Because they are self-referring, meta-theoretic, and universal, they are ultra-deductive, an entire level of generality higher than standard ABC reasoning examples in geometry, mathematics, and logic. They also assume a prior system of inquiry that is reliably accurate with regard to testing claims for truth in a commonly real world. They are based on general reason or rationality itself. This includes the entire system of common sense and principles of logic, as well as the ultimate court of last resort standards or criteria that govern our thinking about anything generally, including our assessments and theorizing about moral and ethical obligation. Thinking must function with these ongoing cognitive values, obligations, principles, basic concepts, and definitions in order for us to be able to think at all. But the components of general reason preclude God in advance. And because reason is universal, this preclusion of God is comprehensive. Consequently, these two new arguments are logically and meta-theoretically deductive, decisive, and final. That's a first in the history of human thinking, atheist or not. Those arguments are consequently fatal to all arguments that ignore the point of Kai Nielsen's remark about the necessity and consequences of a prior, higher authority criterion. Consequently, to even discuss the question of God's existence is to already accept God-precluding standards of an independent, truth-indicating, morally obligating rational system necessarily used to survive and flourish. Those standards are fatal to belief in God. In fact, belief in God already depends on those standards of general rationality to make sense of the concept of God itself. But reason not only does not need God for anything as the prior standard for deciding what is true about anything, it precludes God prior to analysis. The first meta-theoretic argument for atheism is the prior moral criterion argument. Any moral criterion for God's goodness must already assume a logically prior, ultimate, comprehensive, God-precluding moral good to identify what any moral argument for God is trying to prove prior to analyzing the issue. Therefore, there is no God, and any moral argument for God is necessarily based on a prior atheistic, God precluding moral good that stands on its own. Any moral argument for God already requires God precluding atheistic assumptions and criteria about moral goodness, including the assumed moral good of rational thinking and the moral obligation to reason as the only way to survive and flourish. The second metatheoretic argument for atheism is the prior truth criterion argument. The prior standards of analysis already preclude God as even a relevant factor in deciding what is true about the existence of God issue. Therefore, there is no God, and any argument for God is based on atheism. Those new deductive arguments for atheism are successful as far as they go in the discovery process, operationally, legitimizing atheism as a given starting point in terms of immediate analysis for surviving in the dark world. But that process of how the principles by which those arguments of all thought are governed, or how they ought to proceed, is itself indistinguishable from the existence and behavior of an ideal mind that is in turn, all of its aspects taken together, indistinguishable from God. Using those arguments, atheism has unwittingly proved the existence of God with metatheoretic finality. It has ignored what reason itself already assumes and what it implies in how it necessarily operates as an ultimate influence transcending mind that must necessarily be referenced and appealed to in order to evaluate and judge all things. Rational atheism necessarily assumes qualities of God in reason itself without any justification for them. Rational neutrality itself assumes what is indistinguishable from an influence transcending God of mind based on what must be assumed in order to theorize for or against God, and arguing for or against these qualities necessarily assumes them. The first metatheoretic argument for belief in God is the prior ultimate moral person criterion argument. Any moral argument for God's goodness must already assume a logically prior ultimate mind-directing and obligating standard for moral good, functioning indistinguishably from a communicating mind in order to identify what any moral argument for God is trying to prove. Only minds can direct or obligate other minds. The second metatheoretic argument for belief in God is the prior truth-deciding person criterion argument. The prior standards of analysis are already assumed to be God as the necessary influence-transcending, mind-obligating factor in deciding what is true about anything, including the existence of God issue and personhood. Therefore, God is necessarily assumed in our thinking, and any argument against God is based on a suppressed belief in God in what is assumed and implied in that process of argumentation itself. Now, because reason has a belief-deciding authority that is ultimate, universal, and comprehensive, it is indistinguishable from a God of mind in how we must view it, use it, refer to it, appeal to it, and act on its authority in order to think, survive, and flourish. Truth is what fits into an already existing equivalence class system of truth-testing principles, criteria, and so on, which, when taken together as a comprehensive system of thought, is indistinguishable from an ultimate mind or God. Asking how I know this is assuming it by requesting reasons for it, as if reason does in fact decide what is a mind, what is a person, what is God. To argue against these principles is to reconstruct that same system all over again as ultimate, comprehensive, and decisive about all possible things that can be thought about, including God, mind, personhood, and that system itself. It simply cannot be argued against or questioned or even thought about without assuming it in those processes. Impersonal things don't obligate. Non-personal entities and concepts cannot have any authority for obligating persons to think according to any rules or principles. That's why reason necessarily functions as a person, because reason is the only possible standard for deciding what a person is in the first place. Reason is the foundation for all knowledge and belief, and any attempt to deny that leads to systemic logical inconsistencies. By directing all thinking, reason also assumes an ultimate perfect goodness as well, not just because it is itself the ideal of how to think, but because it necessarily assumes an equally comprehensive and ultimate good, which all thinking must constantly approximate. Consequently, reason's necessarily assumed independent neutrality, immunity to influences, and exemption from verification and falsification is a fatal problem for atheism and reveals reason's transcendental status as the Logos, the God of thought, existing above everything, affected by nothing. And because reason has these godlike qualities, reason itself is the ultimate Logos, the divine word that governs all things. Both logically and existentially, there is simply nowhere else to go without repeating the same appeal to God in everything but the name. There is no way to even attempt to argue against reason being indistinguishable from God. This is the key to the evasiveness and direct self-contradictions of both the scientific establishment and academia about the God issue. Both cartels avoid discussing or even mentioning meta-theoretic criteria and reflexive analysis of universal claims. Remember that it's your own mind that decides what's real in any sense, but because we are prone to be mistaken due to our limited abilities and our tendency to knowingly and deliberately contradict ourselves, our goals, and our values, we can decide what's real only by basing such decisions on the ultimate criteria embodied in the system we call reason. Reason is instantiated in us as the image of God in the mind, in the exact same way that an operating system is imaged onto an electronic storage device such as a computer hard drive. So the issue of the existence of God is really about personhood in relation to this ultimate notion of sentient reason as necessarily the image of God. In the logical beginning is the Logos, deciding all issues. So what is necessarily used to get to either belief in God or atheism turns out necessarily itself to be God already. Reason comprehensively exemplifies a God's eye view of the total reality. Reject or deny that claim, and you're doing the exact same thing that the claim asserts and describes. Reason is necessarily, in all the core essentials, indistinguishable from the classical notion of God, precisely because reason decides all issues about personhood as well as everything else, including God. Furthermore, God is manifested in our awareness of moral obligation, but that's only because moral obligation is already built into general reason's governing and influencing of all beliefs and behavior, whether moral or not, which specifies obligations logically prior to acting on our assessments of how to think and live. Reason is necessarily the Logos, indistinguishable from an obligation-imposing subject outside of and separate from ourselves, and yet comprehensively functioning within us in spite of our limitations due to finite resources for verifiable and falsifiable certainty, and that strange tendency to deliberately contradict our own assumptions, standards, values, and goals. So reason is the sovereign critic of every sphere of knowledge. The belief-deciding authority of reason is already God-level. Reason is all-knowing as the truth-evaluating instrument of all possible knowledge. Reason is ultimately authoritative and sovereign as the final court of appeal. Reason is omnipresent as the universally decisive inferential factor throughout space and timelessly eternal across all moments of time. And reason is transcendent in being neutral and immutable or unchangeable in being, immune to all influences. General rationality operates at the highest conceivable level of governing analytic authority over all issues concerning all domains of predication, including all of the same issues about even itself. General rationality assumptions meta-theoretically dictate the standards for defining everything in the first place, including minds, persons, standards, reason, logic, language, meaning, purpose, goodness, evil, God, and general rationality itself. We must refer to these standards because we are limited and have personal histories of deliberate self-contradiction in relation to our own goals, purposes, values, and ideals. We just don't perfectly actualize that ideal system of standards in our lives, and often even forget them or forget to apply them or misapply them, even though we are somehow mysteriously called back to them in order to recognize our defections from those standards. Without the logically necessary godlike and morally obligating authority of reason, neither God's existence nor anything else can be concluded. So essential aspects of God's being must be assumed in general reason itself to decide whether or not God exists. And that is the central issue of both atheism and belief in God in relation to the necessity, universality, adequacy, efficacy, and ultimacy of reason as a system, which must already be assumed and operating in order to discover whether claims are true or not. Consequently, this system of universal rationality, a system of necessary and logically basic assumptions, is as ultimate and mind-like or person-like as any personal ultimate God is conceivable of being. There is nothing that those guiding assumptions do not already cover in our thinking about ourselves and the world. They are the image in us of a godlike mind, however imperfectly they are instantiated us individually in our lives. And my actions in relation to that ideal are whatever they are only when judged by that same rational standard. All criticism and all thinking assumes ideal rationality. As Sam Harris has said, certain logical relations are etched into the very structure of the world, and they are etched into us as well, as part of that world. Any contemplation of these ultimate assumptions of mind, such as reason, formal logic, the rule set of an ordered context of reality, a hierarchy of values, and the obligation to proceed in your life according to a system of rules of thinking results in an endless stream of new knowledge when applied to our ongoing experience of the world. The rules of reason are a precondition, not simply of experience, but of communication, and therefore of society. Consequently, these ultimate decisive rules and ideals of thought actually convey knowledge and even wisdom by merely thinking about our world of objects, our experience, our history, our belief systems, and our lives in relation to those rules and ideals of general reason. And the fact that we must assume and refer to those standards of rationality implies an equally ultimate purpose. Use the standards for what? Why use them at all? Why use them in the first place? And an ultimate purpose necessarily depends on a hierarchical set of ultimate values. This system of assumptions is a unified instrument of thinking which necessarily obligates, defines, and influences the mind as the ultimate operating system for thinking about anything. Consequently, all thinking necessarily both assumes and references an already idling engine, an unchanging and enduring supervisory system of thinking made up of prescriptive evaluative standards of thinking assumed simultaneously just to be able to think or even get out of bed in the morning. Reason doesn't actually do anything, yet it makes all the difference in the world every day of our lives. It is absolutely inert, yet it decides everything and makes inquiry itself possible. Arguing against this merely reinvokes it, and the rationally necessary is necessarily the experientially real, because any argument denying that is self-contradictory in trying to rationally necessitate its own truth about the experientially real. Reason is the only thing that can decide these matters. The knowledge of everything about God, including arguments in support of that belief that God exists, is decided completely and only by the power and authority of reason. If one recognizes the necessary ultimacy and universality of reason, the logos of reason logically follows. So the essential properties of our own system and standards of thinking are a system of mind, personal mind, an equivalence class system that is indistinguishable from the essential defining properties of a classically construed concept of God. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Reason, as Schopenhauer said, deserves to be called a prophet, because by showing us the consequences of our actions in advance, it predicts the future. It prophesies. That's why reason is a perfect power of restraint when we are possessed by some base passion, some fit of anger, some covetous desire that will lead us to do things that we regret.